Welcome to the program today. Mondo Gonzales here in studio, and I have through Skype our good friend Graham Keelan, all the way from England. And if you have not seen our previous sessions, certainly encourage you to go back onto our YouTube channel and to check out the playlist of where we're really talking about the history of Israel from basically the first century all the way up into modern Israel. And we're talking about the ways in which God has been faithful to fulfill his promises, to bring Israel back from all the countries of where it was scattered, and to bring them back into their land, and looking at the different scriptures that describe this. But we've also been looking at the way that God involves human beings to accomplish his purposes. God will keep his promises. And so this has been a fascinating exploration, really, of the history of modern Israel and how God has brought it together. And so, Graham, welcome all the way from England. It's good.
Very much, Mondo. Good to do this with you again. The story's progressing, right?
Yes, it is. And kind of from your own perspective, we're on session number 9 here, which is good. And so kind of give a little bit of a review. I kind of gave a snapshot, but give us maybe a little bit more of a review for where we've gone and then where we want to end up.
Okay, so well, as you said, we began with the first century, looking at the dispersal of the Jews, why they were dispersed from their covenant land. That was that we did that, and whose land is it anyway, didn't we? And eventually we're going to come back to that very same question right at the end of this series, right? But I think what we wanted to do was just build the story or explore it, because the story's gone on 2,000 years before you, I, or any of the audience was around, you know. So we did that, and then we went through the different times that the Jews, especially in the early 100 years after Jesus' death, wanted to establish the temple on Temple Mount, that third temple, and it just never happened for them. And then, of course, 2,000 years of in the diaspora, but then also, what ran about the 1500s with the beginning of the Reformation was a major move. And I think in the session we did last week, it sort of brought that 400-year window from beginning to end, concerning the Protestant Reformation, and then from to the Balfour Declaration, and how it was all connected with the Restorationist movement from the Puritans, and then obviously the political movement, the political Zionist movement, and the motives also for the Christians, which kind of dropped off last century. But the motive really was for the Jews to return so that they could not facilitate the second coming, but they understood that the Jews had to be in the land for that event of Jesus' return to gather his people. So that was the primary motive for the Restorationists, the Puritans, etc. But of course, politics then comes into play, and certainly in last century, that completely went out of the window. But in terms of the return of Jesus, now it was just getting the Jews into the land. We thought it was a good idea, and so we got all these streams, I think, flowing together. And and the story is rich. It's very complex. So we are getting there, but we're getting there slowly. And I do think, and kudos to everybody who stayed with us on the journey, because it's. I think you got to love this stuff. You got to have a passion for some history to really, to want to continue the journey, stay the journey, and at least. And to be honest with you, Mondo, we barely. I don't even know if we're scratching the surface, right? But this is a sweep of history. This is a grand meta narrative, and of course, we're trying to bring the biblical, prophetic narrative into that as well, scriptures. And so, where are we going to go from this one? We'll look at the period now up until the outbreak of the Second World War, so the British Mandate period, and then we'll look at the War of Independence. I think the next session, and we'll just do the different ideas of partition, and then eventually, then we'll discuss, I think, also some of the modern complexities. Some of the moral complexities of the modern state of Israel, because I don't think it's as cut and dry as people would like it to be. It's messy. So we're going to maybe explore some of that. And then obviously where we want to end up is the prophetic scriptures about, what is the end of this story, concerning God's people in his land, in their land. So we'll look at Revelation chapter 12. So that's kind of the rest of the series that we're going to do. 4, 5, 6 sessions, I think, and then we'll have a wrap on it. So yes, but you know what? Last week we spoke about Balfour, did we not? Well, I have some breaking news. I want to introduce some breaking news, Mondo, because I just turned on my laptop when I got home today, and I saw this. It was a pro-Palestine protesters / historic painting at the University of Cambridge, right? So it's very quick. Pro-Palestine protesters / historic painting. Footage shows Palestine Action, this Palestine Action group, spray painting a 1914 piece depicting Lord Arthur Balfour, who was responsible for the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which stated that the British government supported, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, end quote. And then they go on to say, Britain's support for the continued colonization of Palestine hasn't wavered since 1917, Palestine Action said in a statement. Well, on that, actually, they're quite wrong, because Britain did waver quite a few times.
It's true. It's very true.
So we're going to look at those wavers as that wavering in this session here. But yeah, so that I don't know what Mr. Balfour thinks about his painting being slashed and defaced, and they put big blobby spray paint on his face. I do think people sometimes have more time than sense, but there you go. What can you say? But yeah, it seems to be the usual suspects doing that. So obviously, the present situation, or even the idea of Zion, it just stirs up so much emotion, so much animosity. So and you wonder why. Right, because I listen to some of these commentators, because when let's just say when nobody's protesting about Assad and all the people who are being killed and by his own government. Nobody's walking the streets of London or New York or Washington or Paris or wherever, saying, stop Assad or anything like that. It seems that doesn't matter. Muslims are killing Muslims. That doesn't particularly, register on people's radar. Neither when the Chinese and the Uyghurs, in the sort of persecuting, and a bit of some genocide going on there. Nobody's protesting the Chinese embassy, with any of that. And in fact, nobody's protesting anything except when it comes to this. And so people have to ask themselves, why? Why is this such what's the expression I'm looking for? Why is this such a raging inferno in people's hearts, consciousness? Something else is going on here, and of course we know that there's something spiritual going on as well. But yeah. So anyway, that was the breaking news. So let's kick into this week's session then, shall we? And we're looking now at. We called this one the War of the Words, and so people will catch a bit of twist there on H.G. Wells. And so we left the last session 31st of October 1917, the Australian light cavalry, the light horsemen, were charged across the desert of Beersheba under Ottoman cannon fire, and we explained the prophetic our prophetic pattern in the Old Testament, that this is when Britain goes into the British forces, because the Australians are fighting obviously as a part of the British Empire, so they take Beersheba. Allenby, the general overseeing the British expeditionary force there, he takes Gaza a week later. Remember, they tried to take it twice on 2 separate occasions and they couldn't. But as soon as they got Beersheba, they managed to get Gaza. So he takes Gaza on the 7th of November. Jaffa fell on the 16th. And by the end of the month, they're on the outskirts of the Holy City. On the evening of the 7th of December, the first British troops saw Jerusalem. So we're talking 1917.
So,
yeah.
Well, let me just say, so who, in this particular situation, so people understand, who are the British fighting? Are they only fighting Arabs, or what's kind of give a more broader, who else are they fighting there? I mean.
Okay, so basically they're fighting the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks and the Germans.
Okay.
So the Germans have a presence in the Holy Land. So it's mainly the Turks, because of course the Ottoman Turks were not Arabs. So they're as people may not be aware, they're 2 different groupings. The Turks are a European-based grouping. The Arabs are Semitic. The Ottomans have ruled Palestine, or that whole area, since 1517, right? So their rule is coming to an end, and of course the British had kind of sort of fostered the idea of an Arab uprising. We can't really get into that, but the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein. He has basically, he said that the Brits have said, kind of promised him, but not quite, that, okay, if you get your people, throw the Turks out, you can have Arab independence. So he has 2 sons who come into play, Abdullah and Prince Abdullah and Prince Faisal. But of course, the idea, what was happening there was that the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, he thought he's going to have the entire region was going to be the new kingdom a new Arabian kingdom under his monarchy, under his dominion, and that really wasn't promised him. But the Arab uprising was a bit of a damp squib. It didn't really do much. But anyway, by the end of that period, so he's king of the Hijaz, which is like on the Saudi Arabia now, on the western border of the Saudi Arabia, and taking in Mecca and Medina, all those places. Well, he's ousted by another Arab warlord called Saud or Saud. I think it's Prince Saud. I'm not too sure what his full name is. And of course, he throws out Hussein out of the Hijaz. And of course, that family now rules and has ruled. That's why it's called Saudi Arabia. It's the House of Saud. So now what are the Brits now going to do with the promises they kind of, through Lawrence of Arabia, they kind of promised him to, where we can give you some territory. So this comes into play actually with the territory of Transjordan. But so anyway, the Brits are fighting. The British Empire is fighting the Ottomans, and the Germans are in there as well. Okay, so they're marching on Jerusalem. It's pretty intense fighting. There's a dogfight between German and British planes over the Mount of Olives. And at 3 a.m. on the 9th of December, German forces withdrew from the city. By 7 a.m., the last Turk left the city of Jerusalem, and to grant the Prime Minister's request of capturing the Jerusalem as a Christmas present for the British nation. Interestingly, the last Turk left on the first day of Hanukkah. which is so again you just wonder whether there's some connection here with which is the Maccabean thing when they got their independence. So Jerusalem then was surrendered. Just some very quick history here. 6 times the Mufti tried to surrender the city. It was quite farcical actually. 6 times he was refused because nobody accepted his surrender. Basically, the first time he went out, he saw some mess cooks of the British Army, and they're just collecting eggs from a chicken coop, and he goes out, he's trying to surrender the city, and they're like, don't speak to us, Gov, go speak to somebody else. So they just so 6 times he's trying to do this. Two sergeants, also British sergeants, they come out, jump out from the wall, hey, halt, and the Mufti's trying to surrender the city, and they're saying, no, we don't want it, but we'll pass on the orders to our, commanding officers. So 6 times he tries to do this. Eventually, he manages to speak to a guy called Major Shea, I think, who says, I'll go tell Allenby. Allenby's sat in Cairo. He's sat in Egypt somewhere. He's not in Cairo, but he's sat in Egypt somewhere. Or is he in Gaza? I'm not too sure where he sat with Lawrence of Arabia, and he finds out that Jerusalem is surrendered. So eventually they accept the surrender. But here's something very interesting: is that the surrender, Mondo, is that it was done with a bed sheet tied to a broom. So this farcical thing, and it was like the Pied Piper or the Wizard of Oz, and he kept getting a crowd with him, trying to walk around, Christians, Muslims, Jews, trying to surrender to anybody who looks like he's a British officer or a mess cook or what have you. And so eventually does that. But the poetic irony as a Briton, Mondo, for me, is that the white flag that they surrendered with, a woman offered him her blouse, and he felt that's a little inappropriate for a Muslim to be surrendering with a woman's blouse. So they got a bed sheet from the American colony.
Of course.
So that was like the Spaffords, the Horatio and Anna Spafford. People might know who they are. They were So it's kind of I felt when I read that some poetic justice that Jerusalem was surrendered to the British with an American bed sheet, and it's kind of like I felt like it was a bit of a recompense for 1781 and Yorktown and all that, say it's just kind of
yep.
So eventually anyway, and then there's that famous picture then of Allenby. So he gets a signal, please don't, when you take the surrender, get off your horse, don't do anything Napoleonic or Kaiserite, so which is, you got that famous picture, we'll try and put that up there, of him walking in through the Jaffa Gate, receiving the surrender, So, and then of course the war ends. It's another year really before Britain gets full control of the full territory of Palestine, and armistice is signed on the 11th hour of the 11th month, 1919, and interestingly, Chaim Weizmann, he has a prearranged appointment with the Prime Minister David Lloyd George. They don't know when the armistice is going to be signed, and he walks into Lloyd George's office, his office in Downing Street, and he sees him weeping there, reading the Book of Psalms. So again, it's just you don't how these men were moved, in their task to do this. So Weizmann then. So let's skip a couple of years. For 1917 and from 17 to about 1920, 1919, 1920, the territory is under British military occupation. And then in 1920, it becomes under civil government. And so in all that time, though, what's been happening is the Allied powers have been trying to work out what we're going to do with all this land, right? And so who's going to have what? And of course, it was divvied up between Britain and France. But this is really where the Americans now come to the fore, because Woodrow Wilson, who was like one of the founders of the League of Nations, although America never joined in the end, he's putting his ideas about. Basically, you got Britain, France, and America now really determining the course of the future of that region. And the Americans had their own idea. He didn't want European imperial power to be maintained and to all of that. So it's interesting also at this time, Chaim Weizmann and the Prince. There are conversations going around now, even in the cafes in Jerusalem. What's this new Palestine going to look like? What's the new governance? The general idea was, because Prince Faisal now, he wanted this concept called the Greater Syria, right? So he's thinking, well, he's going to get Syria. The Brits are behind me. I'll get the whole. But of course, the French wanted Syria, so that's kind of like going to be, a bit of a big spanner in the works. But him and Weizmann were having these conversations, and Weizmann was quite happy to have a Jewish sovereign territory within a greater Muslim Syria. So right from the outset, the Zionists are thinking, yeah, we can kind of work this arrangement as long as we can have our homeland, and we in the protection then of the Muslim world. So that's sort of that's one conversation going on. There are problems straight away with the Balfour Declaration. So the first riots really occur in 1920. So it's called the Nabi Musa riots, and so it's the Feast of Moses or the Festival of Moses or something. And on this, 60,000 Arabs gathered to protest the Balfour Declaration. And this is where we're introduced to a very young Haj Amin al-Husseini, right? So he would later become the mufti that causes all of the problems, right? But he holds up a picture of Prince Faisal saying, "This is your king. Palestine is our land. The Jews are our dogs." And so, this is the first riot that goes on. I'll just have a quick read here of that. It says... So at that, then an old Jew was beaten to death. The furore turned into madness. Many drew daggers and clubs, crying, "The religion of Muhammad was founded by the sword." The city became a battlefield. The crowd chanted, "Slaughter the Jews." And then some of the moderate Arabs hated violence, but were starting to loathe not just the Zionists, but the British too. So immediately, we said this on the last session, that the declaration itself is going to cause problems throughout the British mandatory period. And I think what we should do is actually talk about the mandate itself. Do you want to add anything before we go on to that?
No, I think that as people kind of understand that the details here are so amazingly complex, but it does tell us, and we're going to see this more and more, that ultimately the British learned a lot. They were the first ones truly in the modern era to step in to really two groups of very unruly people. And so we're going to see that, and we know the promises of God are there. We know that Joel chapter 3 verse 2 talks about dividing up God's land, and this is one of the way that God was bringing it all back. But we also know, and what I found when I took modern Israel classes in college, I had my own level of naive thinking that the Jews were just they did everything wonderful, and yet coming to realize that they caused a lot of trouble as well in this situation for the British Empire. And so we'll see that as we see this, as you're watching here, as you watch this develop. Again, there's nobody righteous, whether the Jews or Arabs or anybody else. Let's just remember that.
Yes, let's just remember Paul and Romans, eh?
Yep.
Yeah, that's kind of a Jew and Gentile. But I think, yes, and I think there is this, maybe there was a naivety on the part of the British, because in a very secularized society, of course, which Britain was becoming then, is that the idea of sacred land, it's almost like, well, can you share this? Can you not share this land? And it's like, no. Now, maybe we can share it in a way, like say, Weizmann was saying well, if we can have our autonomy here and under your greater Syria, and Faisal was up for that. He said, yeah, Palestine is your land. It belongs to the Jews, etc. So the hardening of the Arab cause to the Jewish Zionist movement, really sort of like it's not homogenous. It comes from people like Haj Amin al-Husseini, where the moderates are literally driven out of Arab of the Arab intellectual political class. In fact, they're murdered. We'll look at that. A civil war breaks out. So no change there, right? Fatah, Hamas. So it's just a case of it is complex, and I think this is where we are now going to get into the area where this is complex, and it's morally complex. So, and we discussed earlier on, when we wanted to do this, well, for me anyway, everybody has a narrative, and I wanted to look past the narrative, through the narrative, to see, what are the facts, because people take the facts. People can take facts of history and create a narrative. People can take other facts of history, create another narrative, and so, but the narratives become perverted if you don't take all the facts of history. You just take selective facts. So what's interesting here, we're going to look at the Palestine Mandate. So basically, the Balfour Declaration is simply a declaration by the British government of intent to facilitate a national home for the Jews. It then goes to the San Remo Conference, where all the other allied powers then say, now we can do this. Let's move towards doing that. And then it goes to the League of Nations then, where it's accepted internationally as a document, as a governing document over the areas of the mandates. There were different areas of mandates, but Britain was awarded the Palestine mandate. France was given Syria and Lebanon. And the idea, we'll read it now. And all I've done is gone straight to the UN webpage to lift this off. So again, people, UN, you can't go to the UN. So it might have a little bit of, you'll see some language in there, but it just gives an understanding of what the mandate, the system was. So I'm just going to read this. By being made part of the Palestine Mandate, the Balfour Declaration was given an international dimension. The mandate concept itself was a compromise between the prevailing colonial system and the principle of self-determination of people under foreign rule, a principle championed by President Woodrow Wilson. Following the victory of Britain and her allies in the First World War, the mandate system of the League of Nations placed many of the former subject peoples of the Ottoman, German, and Austro-Hungarian empires under the tutelage of certain victorious powers. The stated aim of the mandates was to guide the peoples ultimately to independence, right? So it wasn't about maintaining colonial rule. It was sort of a stopgap. But we're going to need to do this to establish systems of governance and administration and all of that, right? Syria and Lebanon were placed under a French mandate, and Palestine and Transjordan were placed under a British mandate. Under the Covenant's provisions for independence of mandates, the two French mandates achieved their independence before the end of the Second World War. Lebanon's came in November 1943, followed by Syria in January 1944. Jordan received independence in 1946. Palestine, however, became a scene of conflict. The Covenant of the League of Nations required that the wishes of the communities affected be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. So again, this is what the declaration said about without prejudice, people's civil religious rights. This, however, was ignored in the case of Palestine. I would disagree there, because in terms of it actually never said political or national rights. It said the civic and religious rights of I think when they drafted that, I think they were pretty, shrewd about, because when you talk about political and national rights, well, that's a completely different thing. So I can have my civic and religious rights and be living in America, and I'm a foreigner, I'm an alien, right? But but when I have American rights, well, that's a different story. I got national rights. Okay, so. But on President Wilson's insistence during the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, a commission was appointed to ascertain the wishes of the indigenous populations. The commission recommended an American mandate over Syria, including Palestine. That's interesting. So it wasn't going not to the British or the French, but the Americans, maybe who were trusted more, was to say, okay, you take over the whole Syria thing, including Palestine, and you look after it. You bring them all to independence. In assessing the wishes of the indigenous population of Palestine regarding the Jewish immigration there, the commission called for serious modification of the extreme Zionist program for Palestine and of unlimited immigration for Jews. So this, again, is going to be a problem. The immigration is going to be a problem. The commission declared that this program, aiming finally to making Palestine distinctly a Jewish state, would be a serious injustice. Dealing with the Zionist claim that they have a right to Palestine based on their occupation of 2,000 years, the commission remarked that this claim can hardly be seriously considered. So again, this idea of the sacredness of the land, for the Jews, 2,000 years, and even for the Muslims, in this very secular organization, it's like, well, you were there 2,000 years. It can't, the fact you can't reclaim it now after 2,000 years is not a serious consideration. The British Foreign Secretary, another one now, Lord Curzon, so we're talking about the wavering, warned that the term national home really meant a Jewish state, which it did, because both Balfour and Lloyd George said it did, in which the Arabs would be second-class citizens. He declared, I think the entire concept wrong. Balfour himself acknowledged what was being done and noted, quote, that so far as Palestine is concerned, the Allied powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which they have not intended to violate. In other words, what he's saying there, even Balfour is saying this is all going to go wrong because they're intending, they're saying one thing, but they're going to actually do something else. Nevertheless, the plans for Palestine moved forward in April 1920 at the San Remo conference. So the Jewish Agency is born then. And again, here's another noteworthy thing. Remarkably, the mandate did not once use the term Arab. Although the Palestinian Arabs constituted 9/10 of the population at the time, they were referred to in the document only as the non-Jewish communities of Palestine. Noting the irony, one writer likened the formulation to calling the multitude the non-Jew. The only protection given to the rights of the Palestinian Arab majority was a phrase stating that nothing shall be done which might prejudice their civil and religious rights. Any reference to their national or political rights, however, was conspicuously absent. Can't get my words out tonight, Mondo. So again, that's sort of like what the we discussed that the declaration then incorporated into the mandate was going to cause problems for all concerned. So it's ratified in September 1922, and but something else happened. Though the British government, a policy statement of July 1922, subordinated this principle of the development of self-governing institutions to a secondary consideration. The statement, known as the Churchill Memorandum, because he knew what was going on, made it clear that the establishment of self-governing institutions in Palestine was to be subordinated to the paramount pledge and obligation of establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine. So it's called the dual obligation, Britain's dual obligation to the Zionist organization and the Palestinian Arabs. And as I said, it's going to cause major problems. But Churchill wanted the paramount thing to be the establishment of the national home for the Jews. And it's interesting, no Palestinian or Arab leadership was invited to the San Remo conference. So again, they felt left out. This land, we've been told what's going to happen. We have no say in it, and yet the declaration says so. Now, we can get the impression, of course, that it's all bad in Jerusalem or in Palestine in the 20s and the 30s, but it's not really. It's called the golden age of the British Mandate. I'm going to pause there. Do you want to say anything on that mandate thing?
No, I think that what people need to realize is the back and forth that's taking place here by looking at the powers that be, and also to see that what I just lean on is going back to how much the kind of the spirit of Balfour remains in here, and even Churchill picks it up in that, hey, look, yes, we know that there's going to be some challenges here, but the key thing is that the Jewish homeland, at least at that time, needs to be a focus that is not going to be ignored. And yes. Again, when we go back, and we talked about this in previous sessions, that you have so much of the influence of the Bible in their minds. They were taught this as young chaps, and so these things are flavored there. And to me, that's the key. Is right here at the golden age. As we get into the golden age, they really do want to see the state of Israel as a specific state of Israel happen.
Yes, and obviously there are opponents to that in the British establishment too, in the Foreign Office, even in the army. Like there were anti-Zionist Jews, there were anti-Zionist British politicians, and people working for it and then people working against it. Whatever the foreign secretary was at the time, no, we can't go with this, so we got to curtail with that. So again, that whole idea of that what the protesters said about it's been unwavering, it really hasn't been unwavering. When we get through this period, we're just going to be surprised a state of Israel even came out of it, because it was touch and go. But anyway, prosperity. Palestine flourished, by the way, economically through the 20s. So the swinging 20s, right? And Jerusalem was swinging. I mean, it was good. They built the Hebrew University there. Jerusalem became, as one commentator said, they're living there, one of the most exhilarating cities of the world to live in. They were opening cafes, everything. The King David Hotel. That grandiose hotel, to which one American tourist thought it was the rebuilt Solomon's Temple. But that's tourist for you, right?
Yep.
So all this is going on, and of course immigration is continuing, but on both accounts, Mondo, both Arab and Jewish immigration. So again, there's sort of like this narrative about. All of there was a certain amount of Arabs in Palestine, Ottoman period. So just looking at some figures, 1880, right? 20 to 30,000 Jews in Palestine, 300 to 500,000 Arabs are the figures that I can best come up with. The problem is the Ottomans did not take census. So censuses. So they just didn't keep records. So the records were only kept when the British moved in. So that was kind of, 300,000 Arabs. It was about 10% of the population, the Jews at the time. 1914, still under Ottoman rule, that period to 1880, there were now probably 80,000 Jews in Palestine and maybe about 800,000 Arabs. But it's increased. It's increasing significantly for the Jews. But a lot of so where are those new Arabs coming from? A lot of it is coming from because of the Jewish enterprise coming into the country. A lot of them are immigrants. So when people say, well, they're immigrants, we're not. Actually, if you want to trace your family back to one of the 300,000 Arabs, then you could say you're indigenous to the land. And they were coming from all over the Muslim world. They were coming from Africa. They were coming from North Africa, So how do they suddenly become Palestinians, within 10 years? So all that identity, and it's interesting because, again, we were talking about narrative, but I was listening to a Palestinian historian, you know, rightfully so. He was saying, well, you know, people were saying a land without a people without a land, and you know, the land was flourishing during the Ottoman Empire. Jerusalem had there was a new railway built from Jerusalem to Haifa or whatever, you know, to Jaffa and what have you. And I think, oh, that's great. Until I read and found out that the railway was sponsored by Jewish money and Jewish and French money, you know. So it's like, but again, people want to pick on their particular narrative, and this is the narrative. So before the Jews arrived, we were doing all right. Thank you very much. It did seem to be a pretty desolate land. Peel himself, the Peel Commission, he actually says that, and Earl Peel has nothing to. He will be commissioned to tell us how it is. Thank you very much, and he will just say how it is. But anyway, by 1918, it's dropped off a little bit in terms of the Jews. But by 1925. There were, you know, 90,000 new arrivals of Jews, you know, since the Declaration 1917. So, you know, the British did open up the doors to Jewish immigration. Of course, this is problematic for the Arabs, and of course, you know, and so there are about 150,000 Jews in total in Palestine by the time of about 1925. You know, probably 800,000 Arabs there or thereabouts. Okay, so again, you know, the difference between the population groups is getting small. It's no longer just 10%. But a lot of them, Mondo, a lot of the Arabs are just coming in because the work is there. You know, and they're coming to industries and working, you know, in this new cosmopolitan Jerusalem. The British literally did build the new Jerusalem there. But even Chaim Weizmann, right, the Zionist leader, he's feeling the heat, the opposition. In 1927, he says this: the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was built on air. Every day and every hour of these last 10 years, when I opened the newspapers, I thought, whence will the next blow come? I trembled lest the British government would call me and ask, tell us, what is this Zionist organization? Where are they, your Zionists? The Jews they knew were against us. We stood alone on a little island, a tiny group of Jews with a foreign past. So again, you have this just the anti-Zionist Jews working against that. Against the Zionist cause. 1925, the British proconsuls congratulated themselves that they had tamed Jerusalem. Herbert Samuel, who was a Jew himself, he was the first High Commissioner. He really opened the door to the Jewish immigration. He returned to London declaring with Olympian delusion that the spirit of lawlessness has ceased. I know. Yep. It's kind of. I think you know, they thought, these guys are going to get along, and that was the idea that. You know, the Arabs needed the Jews needed the Arabs. They're all going to realize they need each other, and they're all going to live as a happy family, you know. But trouble was brewing, as we knew. And interesting, it would erupt over some stones sacred to both Jews and the Arabs. And that was the wall. So just a brief thing here about the second Arab revolt. So the wall, the Jews considered the wall, the kotel, the symbol of their freedom and to pray, you know, and exist in their national homeland. To the Muslims, of course, the wall was where Muhammad had tied his trusty winged steed, Burak, on the night journey to the mosque, right? So again, for both of them, it's sacred ground, and of course, and the Muslims feared that the Jews at the wall, having access to the wall, would lead to the building of the third temple, and we are still there, Mondo. We are still there 100 years later. The threat of the third temple is just like it's crazy. So basically, in Yom Kippur, 1928, this is where the British had actually banned the Jews from blowing the shofar at the wall just to keep the peace with everyone. And they were having a prayer meeting on the Day of Atonement in 1920 in front of the wall, and some British policemen went in and ripped all the chairs out from underneath the people. They fell on the floor. Not Britain's finest hour by any means. But again, it's this idea of they're trying to get them to, they're trying to whether they're dealing. I just think that some were for the Arabs and some were for the Jews, and whoever was there at the time was just like, we just saying, okay. So in the summer of 1929, the Mufti ordered the opening of a doorway that made the wall an Arab thoroughfare, right? So Jews demonstrated across Palestine. The wall is ours. So now you have the Arab riots of 1929. So basically the Jews are pelted by stones from the Temple Mount as they're praying at the wall. At the end of this riot, basically, there are about 131 Jews are massacred. Over half, or more, nearly half of them at Hebron. It's Palestine-wide. 116 Arabs are shot dead by the British police. So basically, the British now have to try and bring control again to these two warring factions. And Ben Gurion is kind of aware of this too. They have the idea of, can we live together in peace? And even as late as, I think, 1934, he approaches the Mufti, because he says, hey, look, our movements began more or less at the same time, the Arab nationalist movement, the political Zionist movement. And he proposes a shared Arab-Jewish federation, or a Jewish entity within a larger Arab federation. The same thing, really, that Weizmann had approached Faisal with, that Faisal now is well out of the picture. And again, the Mufti was impressed with this proposition. So this is the Mufti who goes off to Hitler, right? But he was non-committal. But he had no intention of doing it. So again, this idea of can we actually share this land, even if you're like you control, but we just have an Arab-Jewish federation. But part of the problems with the Arabs is they felt the Jews could, if there was an Arab state, the Jews could kind of, if there was a third majority, they could prevent the state from working. The Jews thought the same about the Arabs, and that's still the situation in Israel today, which is why it's a Jewish state, and we'll get into that in another session. Then you have the Arab Revolt of 36 to 39. So basically in 1935, 66,000 Jewish immigrants come to Palestine from Germany because they're fleeing the Nazis. And obviously this is now, the Arabs are just thinking that this is just going to be a colonial British project. The Jews will be their colonial state, and they're going to be pushed out of the picture. So the Arabs thought the only recourse there was to declare war on the British Empire. It began with 2 Jews being murdered, 2 here, 3 there. And then in the end, the British began to train Jewish militias to help against the revolt. Some of the Jews took the matters into their own hands. There were massacres on both sides. It's important to note there were massacres on both sides, with Jews hurling grenades into cafes in Jerusalem. In the end, though, the British ruthlessly crushed the revolt, and apparently 10% of all the Arab fighting men were either killed or expelled. It was a pretty ruthless crushing. The Mufti went into exile because he's the one who's gone to Hitler and say, listen, when you finish with the Jews in Germany, please come down here. We'll sort them out in Palestine as well. A civil war within the Arab-Palestinian leadership breaks out, and the Mufti ruthlessly murders all of his opponents. And then, of course, General Montgomery was brought in to re-establish order. And this is where then we get the idea with the Peel Commission. So we'll talk quickly through this then. So this is really set up to find out how Britain's going to resolve this problem. They already understood that they could not stay in Palestine. The Jews didn't want them there. The Arabs didn't want them there. So it's a case of so they'd already said in 10 years we're leaving. So this is in 1937, right? And then the Commission's findings were that the cause of the revolt was due to this. And so I'm just going to read this. A quick précis of the Peel Commission report here says that first, the desire of the Arabs for national independence. Secondly, their antagonism to the establishment of the Jewish national home in Palestine, quickened by their fear of Jewish domination. This is kind of like the Arab fears about all of this. Peel goes on to say the Jewish national home is no longer an experiment. The growth of its population has been accompanied by political, social, and economic developments along the lines laid down at the outset. The chief novelty is the urban and industrial development. The contrast between the modern democratic and primarily European character of the national home and that of the Arab world around it is striking. The temper of the home is strongly nationalist. There can be no question of fusion or assimilation between Jewish and Arab cultures. The national home cannot be half national. So the committee concluded that Arab nationalism was also a potent force. It's as intense a force as Jewish. The Arab leaders' demand for national self-government and the shutting down of the Jewish national home has remained unchanged since 1929. Like Jewish nationalism, Arab nationalism is stimulated by the educational system and by the growth of the youth movement. It's been greatly encouraged by the recent Anglo-Egyptian and Franco-Syrian treaties. He goes on to say the gulf between the races is thus already wide and will continue to widen if the present mandate is maintained. The sincere attempts of the government to treat the two races impartially have not improved the relations between them, nor has the policy of conciliating Arab opposition been successful. The events of last year proved that conciliation is useless. And also what Peel also determines is that the idea that, the Jews have stolen the land, that they have... They've gone and taken Arab land. He said that the shortage of land is, we consider, due less to the amount of land acquired by Jews than to the increase in the Arab population. And the fact is that Jews really were building on sand dunes and on swamps. So again, it wasn't that they were stealing cultured land. So, but on this then, Mondo is effectively when the two-state solution is born, and we could see there what he recommended was to give 18 to 20% to the Jews along the Mediterranean and 80% to the Arabs. Of course, we know that the Arabs rejected that. The Jews accepted it in principle, and in Britain, and said, well, we can negotiate from that. But in the end, Britain decided not to adopt the Peel Commission recommendation because it would have meant the displacement of 300,000 Arabs from the Jewish territory into Arab territory. So again, why is there a vast... There are very few actually Jews in Arab territory because there's no commerce there. It's actually the Arabs are in 300,000 are actually in Jewish territory. By 1939, I think we looked at the numbers there. You're looking at 445,000 Jews and about 1 million Arabs, and 300,000 of them are in what would be considered to be Jewish territory that's going to be partitioned. There is Peel does say something about the. And I've just lost the quote there. Oh, in the end, Peel complained that, quote, in contrast to the Zionists, not once since 1919 has any Arab leader said that cooperation with the Jews was possible. So, even he knew that they were not going to talk. They were not going to share it. So the only thing we can do is partition the thing up. But straight after getting rid of suppressing the Arab Revolt, the British did a complete volte-face. The White Paper, the 1939 White Paper, famous. It's called the Paper of Appeasement. Basically, what's going on? The Prime Minister is Neville Chamberlain. He's the guy who'd gone to Germany to Munich, come back with Adolf Hitler's assurance. I have in my hand this piece of paper.
Peace in our time.
Peace in our time, and he's not a warmonger. He doesn't want another war. Europe's just come out of war, So he's thinking, I've given them this, I give them this, but in the end, they know that war's on the horizon, and but they know that they can't lose the support of the Arabs. They need the Arab support. So the thing was for Chamberlain, it was a case of if we've got to offend one party, then let it be the Jews, and and they literally reneged on on what it was. And interesting, what they offered them there, they offered the annulment of no Jewish immigration, or they restricted it to 75,000 over the next 5 years, 15,000 a year. After that, there'll be no Jewish state. There will be an Arab state in Palestine, and the Arabs will be able to no more land for the Jews to be bought, and then the Arabs will then be able to determine the Jewish presence in the land. It was the greatest offer that the Arabs have ever received throughout the 20th century and even afterwards, and they turned it down. They said no. That was the Mufti again from his exile in Lebanon. So again, that was the ultimate waiver. But the war broke out the following year. Chamberlain was out of prime minister. Churchill was in, and there was a truce then between the Zionist movement, because Ben Gurion, he said, "We'll fight the white paper as if there were no war. We'll fight the war as if there were no white paper." So in fact, the Jews did side with the Allies in fighting the Nazis, and then after the war, the truce was over. But is there just a minute just to read something about Churchill, because his opposition to this, and this will be a good place to end this.
Okay.
If people can just bear with us on this, because he's not prime minister. Obviously, he was part of the colonial secretary in the 20s in setting up, and he was a very, very much a Zionist. But both him and Lloyd George are still in Parliament. I think Lloyd George is in the House of Lords, but they oppose this. But here's what he says in 1939. This is before he's prime minister. So he stands up in Parliament. It says, as one intimately and responsibly concerned in the early stages of our Palestine policy, I could not stand by and see solemn engagements into which Britain has entered before the world set aside for reasons of administrative convenience, and it will be a vain hope, for the sake of a quiet life. There is much in this white paper which is alien to the spirit of the Balfour Declaration, but I will not trouble about that. I select the one point upon which there is plainly a breach and repudiation of the Balfour Declaration: the provision that Jewish immigration can be stopped in 5 years' time by the decision of an Arab majority. That is a plain breach of a solemn obligation. I am astonished that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister of all others, and at this moment above all others, should have lent himself to this new and sudden default. To whom was the pledge of the Balfour Declaration made? It was not made to the Jews of Palestine. It was not made to those who were actually living in Palestine. It was made to world Jewry, and in particular to the Zionist associations. It was in consequence of and on the basis of this pledge that we received important help in the war. That's the First World War. And after the war, we received from the Allied and associated powers the mandate for Palestine. The pledge of a home of refuge, of an asylum, was not made to the Jews in Palestine, but to the Jews outside Palestine, to that vast unhappy mass of scattered, persecuted, wandering Jews whose intense, unchanging, unconquerable desire has been for a national home. To quote the words to which my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, subscribed in the memorial which he and others sent to us, here's what Chamberlain had said. The Jewish people, who have, through centuries of dispersion and persecution, patiently awaited the hour of its restoration to its ancestral home. Those are the words. They were the people outside, not the people in. It is not to... After the period of 5 years, no further Jewish immigration will be permitted unless the Arabs of Palestine are prepared to acquiesce in it. Now there is the breach. There is the violation of the pledge. There is the abandonment of the Balfour Declaration. There is the end of the vision, of the hope, of the dream. I end upon the land of Palestine. It is strange indeed that we should turn away from our task in Palestine at the moment when, as the Secretary of State told us yesterday, the local disorders have been largely mastered. It is stranger still that we should turn away when the great experiment and bright dream, the historic dream, has proved its power to succeed. Yesterday, the minister responsible descanted eloquently in glowing passages upon the magnificent work which the Jewish colonists have done. They have made the desert blue. They have started a score of thriving industries, he said. They have founded a great city on the barren shore. They have harnessed the Jordan and spread its electricity throughout the land. So far from being persecuted, the Arabs have crowded into the country and multiplied till their population has increased more than even all world Jewry could lift up to the Jewish population. Now we are asked to decree that all this is to stop and all this is to come to an end, where we are now asked to submit. And this is what rankles most with me, to an agitation which is fed with foreign money and ceaselessly inflamed by Nazi and fascist propaganda. It is 20 years ago since my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, used these stirring words. A great responsibility will rest upon the Zionists, who before long will be proceeding with joy in their hearts to the ancient seat of their people. Theirs will be the task to build up a new prosperity and a new civilization in all Palestine, so long neglected and misruled. Well, they have answered his call. They have fulfilled his hopes. How can he find it in his heart to strike them this mortal blow?
Wow.
Men with vision, eh?
Yeah. And
we need men with vision, Mondo.
I think too, as we wrap it up, I think it's a perfect place, two things to wrap it up in understanding the transition of the white paper of 1939, but then also Churchill's response, calling out again the reneging on the promises that were made prior to this. And I find it interesting too, just you say a man of vision, in that God, as we approach the end of the age, God is not going to allow the world to not be held accountable for their treatment of the Jewish people, as well as God's promises to them. So I think about it in terms, just because everybody has access to the Bible, so just because someone doesn't read the Bible doesn't mean they're not accountable. You're not going to say, oh, well, Lord, I didn't know. God's like, no, you're accountable not only for the gospel, as we know, but also for what the Bible says about the Jewish people and the promises that God has made. And so this is where you see, and here we are 88 years later, at least from the riots and other things, here it's the same. It's the same issue, it's the same challenge. And God's not going to allow it to be. But this is a good point to stop, because as we look over the next really 8-10 years, we're going to see the development up to the United Nations and the establishment of the State of Israel, but also all of the challenges that the outworkings of the white paper caused, especially, again, in light of Nazism and the Holocaust that begins at this same time.
Yes, yeah, it's we're moving into it's highly complex, it's highly nuanced, it's just not a straight narrative, and but in the end, I think we see God is moving in a way. And the Jews are not faultless. We're going to find that too.
Yep.
We're going to find ethnic cleansing on both sides. So, but in the end, we have to hold, I think, to what God's vision is for the Gentiles and for the world and for the salvation of the world, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
So nobody's going to stand in the way of that.
Well, thank you, Graham. It's been always good. And we'll thank you guys for watching as well. Thank you for sticking with us. As you said, there's a lot of details here, but again, overall, it's reminding us that God is going to keep his promises. And to me, that's very comforting as I study, again, Jewish history all the way back. God also holds his people accountable. And for us, we have the promises of the gospel, which is, again, the ultimate thing. And as you mentioned, Graham, the idea that once God restores Israel in 1948, and ultimately at the end of the tribulation, Romans 11, their stumbling brought salvation to the Gentiles, but their restoration is going to bring glory and riches to the entire world. So thanks for watching, everybody. If you haven't seen the rest of it, check out our playlist on YouTube. You'll find all of them there, and we'll catch you next time.